So welcome back to the Evolving Warfighter. My name's Dr. Franklin Annis, and I'm very honored today to be greeted with a very distinguished Marine veteran, Colonel Thomas Gordon, recently retired out of the former position of Director of the Marine Corps Command and Staff College, and recently accepted a new position as the President of the Citadel. So,
Commandant.
Commandant.
Commandant. Yeah, there's a 4-star in charge as the President of the Citadel. I'm not going to assume General Walter's responsibility, but I have the best job, and I have the best job here by far. I'm the Commandant of Cadets.
Yeah. Well, this is where I should have checked my notes better. I should have done better research, I guess.
No problem. No problem.
Well, I should begin by congratulating you with the publishing of your most recent book, Marine Maxims. It's a wonderful book. It has kind of 50 different chapters with various different leadership, I guess, lessons learned, suggestions. I really have to compliment you on how you lay out this book and the fact that every chapter really provides additional resources. So this isn't kind of the attempt to be the final answer, but really opens a door, has several different kind of mini conversations, kind of a path ahead, but really leaves the reader with several different references or books to go out and do further research. And I'm sure you'd be the first to agree, kind of the profession of leadership is kind of never settled, so it's always our job to kind of keep exploring and expanding on those concepts. But excellent book, sir.
Hey, thanks, Michael. It was a humbling experience publishing a book, but it truly has been something I've been working on for over 30 years. And they say that less than 1% of the population is capable of original thought. I consider myself a proud member of the majority. You know, none of these maxims are really mine. They're all things that I have picked up from various great leaders throughout my Marine Corps career, and just kind of captured it, tried to operationalize it a little bit, and then did some research to kind of back it up. And a lot like you and I have talked about this before, I always find my next book in the bibliography of the book that I just read, right, or the works cited that I just read, try to trace it back to the taproot, and that's why I think you and I actually first met, because we found ourselves wrestling with the Stoics, right? So we got all the way back there to 330 BC when we started trying to find some common denominators to a lot of these leadership theories that we're professing.
So I guess to launch off this conversation, I really wanted to explore kind of one of the leadership lessons that you present in your book. And I have to ask you to kind of elaborate on it, or at least explain it. But it was a kind of a trolling incident that happened with a anonymous suggestion box and kind of the problems around that.
Well, yeah, that was in the chapter on toxic leadership. You know, as I said, how I organized the book, or how I came up with the book, was whenever I worked with somebody or in close proximity to somebody that I thought was a great leader, I journaled it. I wrote down whatever attribute that individual was personifying that drew me to his attention. I said, you know, if I'm ever in command, I'm going to do that. Conversely, it wasn't all unicorns and rainbows and parades, right? So I had to work for and in proximity with some martinets over the years. And whenever I worked for a tool, I would just flip the book to its back, and I would ascribe whatever it was that drew me to that person's attention, and just made a note to myself that I would never ever do that if given the opportunity to lead Marines or soldiers. So I tried, wherever I had those elements in the front of the book, I always tried to attribute them where I could. In the back of the book, it wasn't my intent to malign anyone, so I tried to keep that anonymous. But it was an interesting time. I had been a 3. Pretty much the only thing I've done in the Marine Corps is either been a commander or been a director of operations. So I was a 3 of enough units that I can say this without someone trying to do too much of a homework assignment and figure out who I was talking about. But when I was a 3 of the 5, the director of plans, it was a pretty toxic environment over there. So the general had come in and counseled that individual on his toxicity. In this particular case, it was the guy was just he refused to take input from his staff, from his planners. And when the input was presented, he was pretty abusive about it. So in response to the general's mentorship and constructive criticism, he put out a suggestion box. And I always thought that whenever you see an anonymous suggestion box in an organization, it's because people don't feel comfortable coming up and letting you know what's really on their mind. I don't. It's not always that case. I mean, there's a reason why some organizations have those anonymous suggestion boxes, for safety and things like that. But usually, it's an indicator of if someone's leading with that, I find it's because they feel like their subordinates can't bring those issues to them.
So that kind of really launches off where I'd kind of like to get in the discussion with you today about if you're in that type of environment, and we can talk about this from kind of several different levels, but how do you work either as a leader to change that or shape that environment so people become comfortable, or if you find yourself lower down the chain, like what suggestions can you give your boss, or how can you work in that type of environment to try to seek improvements?
Well, right, because I think Andy Stanley, he's a pastor and branched off into a very successful leadership author. He likes to say, if you don't listen to your subordinates, thoughts and opinions, you'll eventually be surrounded by people with nothing to say. Because those that want to contribute, want to be listened to, right? So they want to be heard. Me personally, if I ever find myself in a room and I think I'm the smartest guy there, that's time for me to get really, really nervous. I've always prided myself on, or been lucky enough to surround myself with people that are smarter than I am, and I'm very comfortable in that environment. But there are some people that, quite frankly, smaller men or smaller people, I don't want to make this gender specific, smaller people who are threatened by that. Actually, I think we both have kind of a Socratic leadership philosophy. I stopped telling people what to do when I was a lieutenant. Instead, I ask questions. Sometimes those questions are my own intellectual curiosity. I want to learn. But most of the time, those questions are breadcrumb questions. And instead of giving an order, I'll present it as a question. Try to get them to see the problem. And I've always found, it's been my experience that whenever you present an order to somebody as a question, the solution that they come back with, most cases, always exceeded, whatever I dreamed was going to be accomplished. Right? So in other words, if you tell people what to do, that's exactly what they're going to do. It's a minimalistic approach. But if you present it to them as a question, it's open-ended, 9 times out of 10, they're going to have a better solution than you ever dreamed of. So what happens when you're working with somebody who doesn't subscribe to that same philosophy? Well, at the end of the day, we're a mission-first organization. So it's our job to accomplish the mission, regardless of who our boss is or who's getting credit. A lot of people read the Kane mutiny and they take away the wrong lessons from it. A good friend of mine and fellow author, Andy Milburn, takes a counter approach to that, a counterintuitive approach to it, and instead of putting the blame on the captain in the mutiny, he focuses on the first lieutenant, and how it was his lieutenants the lieutenants failed the skipper. They failed to make the skipper successful because they were just thinking about themselves.
So I guess with my audience, or at least me in the Army side of the house, could you give a brief description of the Kane mutiny, or at least where I could look into that more? It's a reference I'm not familiar with. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the Kane mutiny. It's a World War II story about a mine countermeasure ship that goes through, and basically the captain he's a martinet. He's a toxic leader. Basically, the crew pushes him and pushes back to the point that the guy has a breakdown. And there is a mutiny. Basically, the first lieutenant in the ship, seizes control of the ship in a storm, and the book ends up in the crew's court-martial. And the captain's up. He's being court-martialed as well. He's lost control of his ship. He was relieved. And as I look back on it, it was actually the crew's. Everyone focuses on what an evil guy the captain was, but the lesson that the author was trying to portray in the book was actually, it was the crew's fault, for not making the skipper, the captain of the ship, successful. So, long about way to get to your point, it's our job to make them successful. So how do you make them successful? Because sometimes when you're dealing with, there's many different types of toxic leaders, right? And I like to say there's the dark triad. You get the guy who's a micromanager, who's a narcissist, and maybe a sociopath on the side, right? but a lot of these difficult bosses, they have some type of diagnosis that we may not know what's going on inside them. Some of them may be damaged, right? So doing that frontal assault can be career limiting for yourself. So I wouldn't always profess that. I mean, there's always usually a better way than the frontal assault when you're dealing with a toxic boss. One avenue I always recommend when junior officers are having a difficult time with their boss is I ask them, well, what does your senior enlisted advisor say? What did your first sergeant say about this? What did your sergeant major say about it? Because we all know there is a parallel chain of command, right, with the senior enlisted ranks. Though there's only one commander, the sergeant major, of course, will report up to, the battalion sergeant major will always make sure the brigade sergeant major knows what's going on, right? The company first sergeant will always make sure that the battalion sergeant major knows what's going on. That line of communication cuts both ways, right? So if you're confiding in your senior enlisted advisor, who's been around, at least at the company grade level, he's going to be around longer than you. When you get to be a colonel, a lot of times you'll have been around longer than your sergeant major, but still, there's a wealth of experience there, and that individual is going to be passing that information up. And then what's going to happen is that sergeant major is going to be talking, to your boss's boss, right? So how do you get information up there so that it can come down, and then your boss's boss can give that rudder steer if it's required? Well, you can do an envelopment around your boss if he's toxic by working through the senior enlisted chain of command. Again, what we're all trying to do is trying to be successful, right? We're not trying to, cut your boss off at the knees. You're just trying to make sure that he's getting the feedback that he needs. And sometimes, people can have a low emotional intelligence score, right? They don't realize how they're coming across. I'm a huge believer in the 360 evaluations. I was pushing those real hard in the Marine Corps before I left, and I'm trying to incorporate those into our leadership development model here at the Citadel. Because quite frankly, as a leader, it's very, very difficult to see toxicity in your subordinates. It's a character flaw that every leader should know that they have a blind spot sometimes, and I know I fell victim to that blind spot, and I've seen it firsthand where some very adroit leaders were not able to see, toxicity beneath them. So any type of feedback that you can actually institutionalize within your organization that provides that unfettered feedback up to the top will help every commander be able to see the problem in the round, right? It's not a popularity contest, right? That's not what we're trying to do, but subordinates need to know that they're being heard. Does that answer your question? Please.
Yes, it does, and I guess this kind of ties back into another topic that you cover in your book, and I think you kind of briefly mentioned it, about your question technique is really allowing individuals to not only kind of discover the correct answer that you were looking for, but really have more ownership. And you discuss in another chapter of your book how you should limit your instinct to always make a good plan better and always modify things, because you want to actually allow your subordinates to have ownership, or really maintain that ownership or motivation that they develop something themselves. And I'm a big believer in saying, well, sometimes if you know that something isn't going to turn out exactly right, but it's not going to derail the train, you can go ahead and let someone, gain that kind of learning lesson or improve their plan along the way instead of jumping straight in.
Right. Whenever I make a correction, especially on your top performers, right, I always ask myself, is it worth it? All right. So by me tweaking this thing just that little bit, so me trying to make a 97 and 98, right? Is it worth it? Right? We all want to make our best performers better, but we also have to realize that, right, our best performers are disproportionately affected by constructive criticism. We all say, hey, we relish it. We aggressively get out there and we seek it until your boss gives it to you, right? And then you spend some time staring at the ceiling fan that night, just wondering how could you have screwed up so much? Because those type A high-performing subordinates, you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? And the other thing, you made the point for me, right? The reason why I didn't do it is because, and the reason why I presented it as a question is you want that sense of ownership. right? You want them leaving your office. You want them crossing the LD with a plan, with their plan, that they have confidence in the plan, they're proud of their plan, and they're going to aggressively execute that plan, right? Because they have that sense of ownership of it. If you sit there and you start picking at it, just even on the margins, right, it's going to reduce their incentive, right, to one, exercise initiative, and two, it's going to reduce, their ownership of the plan, which of course, they may not be as spirited in executing it.
Which I think ties into that bigger conversation of, that wonderful command philosophy that everyone wants to see established. We all talk about having mission command. But it's really a practice of that kind of everyday approach to leadership. And if we don't, allow soldiers, Marines to have the input, develop their own plan, do things more their own way, we're really limiting their confidence and not displaying the trust that would empower that type of larger philosophy that we want to see on the battlefield.
Well, much of this is counterintuitive, right? So how do you get your subordinates to operate decentralized? Mission command, our maneuver warfare philosophy requires decentral operations, right? In the Marine Corps, we talk about it as the primacy of proximity. You want that individual at the point of friction to be able to be empowered to rapidly either seize the initiative or change the plan, based on the situations on the ground. So how do you do that? How do you build that confidence, in those subordinates to be able to do it? And a lot of it's, as I say, it's counterintuitive because in the Marine Corps, we do it by focusing first and foremost on discipline, right? So we impose a tremendous amount of discipline, initially in our training model. If you go down to Parris Island, South Carolina, and you see how we make Marines, you'll see what I consider the epitome of discipline, right? But what you don't see down there when they come across the parade deck is a whole lot of initiative, right? We instill that discipline at first, but then what we do is when we bring them into the operational forces, we shift the focus from discipline to cohesion, right? Because if you can build that cohesive unit that has that sense of wellness, that identity, well, then that organization starts to self-police, right? And then you get that self-discipline that's going on, that collective self-discipline within the organization. When you take that cohesion and you bring it together with discipline, well, that's what makes decentralized operations possible, right? Commanders have the confidence and the trust, right, in their subordinates that they're going to do the right thing because they've been inculcated, with the standard operating procedure. So they know what they're supposed to do, right? If you know what you're supposed to do, then you'll have the confidence to deviate when you know that that's not actually going to work in this particular scenario. But I know what the boss wants to do because I understand his intent. I understand the why. Then the boss knows he can trust that subordinate, right? Because he's a disciplined individual, and two, right, they have that sense of cohesion, conformity within the organization. They know. So it's kind of counterintuitive, right? In order to have them go up, exercise all this initiative, first they have to know what the standard operating procedure is. In the business model, there's a corollary in there. There's a great author by the name of Jim Collins. I actually refer to him several times in my book. When I was writing my book, I don't want to digress too much here. When I was writing my book, I tried to open the aperture up a little bit, and I looked for additional sources to either confirm or deny the thesis of whatever that maxim was. And I opened it up. I have a lot of athletic coaches in there, professional sports. I also a lot of resources that I cite come from the business community. So a guy by the name of Jim Collins wrote a great book called Good to Great. It wrote back in 2001. And he talks about a culture of discipline within his organization that he was trying to create, right? He said, first you fill it with self-disciplined people. But once you have those self-disciplined people in there, then you give them that disciplined thought. It's the same thing that the Marine Corps is doing down at Parris Island. They impose that discipline initially on the organization, and then they make sure that they have that disciplined action. So they have that supervision and make sure that they're compliance to standards within the organization. But then once they do that, then he releases it, right? And he releases all that energy so that he wants them to be able to exercise that initiative. He gives them that freedom. But another author that you and I quote quite a bit, Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl talks about that Statue of Liberty on the East Coast should be mirrored with a Statue of Responsibility on the other. It's that freedom of action, that freedom of responsibility within a framework. So you get out there, when I was a company commander, a tank company commander, it's all about the standard operating procedure. We would drill it over and over and over again so that the Marines would know what they would do in a particular situation, right? Not so that they would be rogue, but they would have to do that, but so that they would have a point of debarkation from which they could deviate from. Well, and guess what? The SOP didn't work. But if you didn't know what the SOP was, it's difficult to be able to, then you're freelancing, and then when someone tries to come up and support you on the battlefield, that they have no idea what you're doing. But if you've been in a cohesive organization and they understand what their operating procedures are, you have that cultural discipline within the organization, that's how mission command works, in my humble opinion.
So I guess most of my experience is inside the field of Army medicine. So my experience in applying mission command, or even that concept, is kind of radically different than what you would have, obviously, in your experience in the Marine Corps. And to some degree, I think that you might have an advantage just because the size factor plays a role on kind of how you can manage that. But I guess the question for you would be, well, a couple questions. Number one, how long do you think it takes to take that Marine that's totally disciplined straight out of Paris Island and then convert them into someone capable of having this larger concept of mission command? Or number two, is there a common level of command where that becomes more difficult to manage in the Marine Corps?
Well, you get that junior Marine, that young 18-year-old. They're not the ones that we're really focusing initially on mission command, right? But where we want to inculcate that, of course, is in our lieutenants. You want to breed that in your lieutenants so that they have the confidence to deviate. What we try to do right now with most of our training is introduce situational training exercises and throw them out there and give them problems that they weren't encountering. They weren't prepared for when we came out. I had some great bosses that I worked for. Wild Bill Callahan was my battalion commander when I was a company commander, and this guy would literally, he would stay up for days, dreaming up the situational training exercises to come and just and throw us a big curveball wherever we went. He was trying to inculcate that, that mission command philosophy in there. So we'd go through the planning process. We'd know what we were supposed to do, and then once we crossed the LD, the situation looked radically different than what we had been planning for. Right? So you get them out of their comfort zone, and you allow them to make those mistakes. And then afterward, you pull them in, you dust them off, right? And you do that after action so that we all learn the same thing from it. I think the ideal level there, of course, is at the battalion level that you want to see that. It's a little bit more difficult, at the brigade level when you're commanding through commanders. I had the privilege of commanding a group of 5 disparate battalions, all with us with very different mission sets. So it was difficult for me to, exercise mission command in that. But at that point, at the 06 level in the Marine Corps, what you want to do is, quite frankly, is to set the conditions for your subordinate commander's success. So I think in the Marine Corps, to answer your question, the optimal level is the battalion or squadron level for mission command, in my opinion.
Well, it makes a lot of sense, or at least from an outsider. So I can throw in Donald Vandergriff. I know I had a chance to interview him when his book came out on mission command, and it's kind of a wonderful resource, and it's one that I handed to my boss when it first came out, with the thought of, at least in my field, it's trying to apply it in a feasible way becomes more difficult because you're shifting kind of outside the original maneuver type world. But how does Army medicine keep up with the maneuver forces? Also really needs that challenging or self-syncing lieutenant that can know when to move aid stations or ambulance exchange points as well. And at least pushing that book forward to my boss was an effective way of at least starting the conversation to be like, this is the type of environment that I want to work in. And I guess, so other than, handing a book or trying to find resources, to talk about kind of improvements. Are there ways that if you're a lieutenant out there and you're not, either you're not feeling that you're getting enough flexibility or receiving enough trust, is there a way to really, well, I guess you gave us the NCO chain, but is there a way to really have that deep conversation with the boss about, hey, this is what I'm trying to do, or this is, I'd really like to see more of this philosophy applied?
I guess I can only go back to what I did as a captain and what I did as a battalion commander. With limited success, what I try to do with my lieutenants was, so my lieutenants had an office. I was a tank company commander, and they had the lieutenant's office. The first thing I did when I took company command was I took all the lieutenants, I took their office out. I got rid of all their desks when they had the company gunny go in there and got rid of all their desks. And of course, they were mortified when they came in the next morning. Where are our desks? And I said, well, your office is on the left front fender of your tank. I said, if you don't like the view, you can come back to me, and you can, with permission, you can move to the right front fender. And I was trying to make a point that lieutenants don't need to be in the office. They need to be down there learning their trade, learning their craft, and in the tank, they need to be learning the tank. But in the office, I had the company make this giant sand table. And on that sand table, I got the micro armor out there. And what we would do is we get different books, either historical books, or one of my favorite books is an Army book called The Defense of Hill 781. I can't remember who wrote it. It basically was a modern anthology of Duffer's Drift, which was from the Boer War back, the turn of the last century. But it's a great book. It's got these little vignettes in there of this Army Lieutenant Colonel named Atac Always, and he was fighting in basically it was purgatory, right? The purgatory was he had died and ended up in purgatory, and purgatory looked and smelled and a lot like the National Training Center out there, Fort Irwin. And in order to get to heaven, the guy actually had to defeat the op force. So he went through these series of exercises, and every time he did it, he learned a little bit, just like Duffer's Drift. And so by the end of the book, he was actually able to win. I took that same, training philosophy with my lieutenants, and we would sit down there over the sand table, and we would take these same problems, these same vignettes, right? And then I would let them the lieutenants come up with a creative solution on how they would do it. And then I would come in afterwards. Always, you can never be the first to speak as a commander. You've got to be the last one to speak. And then I would tell them what I thought, right? Because, quite frankly, I did it for two reasons. One, I wanted to assess the creativity, the critical thinking capabilities, of my lieutenants. But two, I wanted them to make sure they understood how I thought, right? Because, when I would give that mission type command order, right, I wanted them to have enough reps and sets with me, right, so that they would know, all right, we've seen something that looks similar to this before, and this is the way the boss did it, right? So the boss is going to expect me to do this, right? But then also, how do you build trust? Well, you build trust by extending trust. It's all about reciprocity. So the lieutenant at that point would know, should have the confidence, because he was able to demonstrate, a successful plan to me, and then so that I would have the confidence to give him that particular mission. So it's that balancing act, but how do you inculcate that? How do you have those conversations? You just got to create that scenario where you can have those multiple conversations. Because one conversation, one book's not going to do it. This is a long development, and just by the time you finally get it right, by about that 18 to 24 month mark, when you finally get everyone, all in sync, well, that's time for you to pass on the colors to somebody else, and redeal, re-ante, and everyone starts again. But yeah, it's a maturation process, but anything that you can do to find a way to do a situational training exercise or a discussion and just kind of walk it through with your subordinate commanders, give them the opportunity to demonstrate some critical thinking, some creative problem solving. You bring it in on the back end, so how you would have done it, right? And I think that builds that command climate where mission command is possible.
That makes a lot of sense, practicing that wargaming aspect. So just out of interest, what was the kind of rough frequency? Like, is this a weekly meeting, or did you...
Every week, every Thursday. Okay. I'm sorry, I left that out. Okay. So we did it every Thursday. When the Marines, In the Marine Corps, you go to the field, beginning of the week, you come back, Marines do field day on Thursday nights and Thursday evening, Thursday nights, and then Fridays usually, battalion PT and then some classes, and then you let them out of the week. I still let them out for the weekends. Normal garrison battle rhythm is what we call it. So during that normal garrison battle rhythm, there wasn't much of a need for the lieutenants down there supervising, field day. That's what we have NCOs for. So I'd pull the lieutenants up. That's when we do it every Thursday.
So I guess you kind of touch on it in your book, but this is kind of, at least on the Army side of the house, what I personally have seen is the kind of the fatigue of the readiness assessments, or the amount of kind of administrative actions are becoming so burdensome that it's influencing whether it's training or the time to develop teams. And I know that you, in your book, talk quite a bit about preparing for inspections and learning how to kind of be an expert and inspection-wise. But did you ever encounter kind of those experiences where you really had to kind of balance or assume risk in terms of the administrative assessment aspects versus the development training of your Marines?
Yes, and there's some dynamic tension there that we can unpack a little bit. So when I saw this probably best when I was in my 06 command. I was working for Lieutenant General Beidler. He was Major General back then, Smoke Beidler. He had the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. And we were pretty long into our sustained stability operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we had been at war at that point, I think, for about 17 years. And, it was starting to show on the readiness of the force, specifically on the material readiness of the force. And basically a lot of those lessons that were inculcated into us as junior officers didn't exist, right? There wasn't a culture of readiness in the Marine Corps. There wasn't a culture of accountability in the Marine Corps. Now, we had some very battle-hardened units that were rotating in and out of theater every 6 months. But what we weren't seeing though was if you broke it, they just brought you a new one, right? Because in combat, the one thing we weren't short of was money. The American taxpayers were continuing to make sure we were properly resourced, but I don't know how well we were, what good stewards we were with those resources. So the Commandant came down, and I know the Army did the same thing. And when that pendulum came swinging back, it was painful for some folks. Having been raised as a tanker, I had a pretty good handle on logistics and maintenance management. But trying to balance that, right, when we're still at war, we're still pushing units out, but now there's this huge press for additional accountability and readiness of the gear, of the material readiness. I think the guy who probably did it best was Major General Brian Boudreau, retired as Lieutenant General Boudreau. He had 2nd Marine Division, and I refer to him in the chapter called Balance Excellence, because he knew how to maintain the balance between operational readiness and making sure that they were both tactically and technically sound, but also making sure that we were taking care of our stuff. General Beidler's mantra was always readiness, 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 and he was a fixed-wing aviator, so he was a F-18 guy. So he had a very different outlook on material readiness than General Boudreau and I did. General Boudreau was an infantryman, I was a tanker. Fixed-wing pilot, if maintenance isn't right, you're falling from the sky. So you're not going to take a lot of risk when it comes to maintenance. As an infantryman, you'd be willing to kind of balance, the emphasis on maintenance per se, just so long as you're making sure that your soldiers or your Marines have time to get out there and exercise their field craft. So it's that constant dynamic tension between being ready to go, having the equipment up and ready, or having a unit that's actually capable of deploying the equipment because they've gone out there and they've trained hard on it. How you do that? Well, you have to take the long view on it. This is not something that you can do short view in the shorthand. What I did when I took over the group, I knew I had about 24 months, and I laid in those big readiness assessments. I laid them in. I laid in how we were going to get ready for those material readiness assessments. And then I overlaid the T, our exercise plan, and how we were going to make sure we were doing all our training exercises so that we would be operationally ready to do it. And then you just balanced it, right? So I had to move some stuff around, but I was only able to do that because I took a 24-month view on it. I knew all the material readiness checks that I had to get, and I knew the operational readiness checks I had to get. And I was able to offset those so that they were, complementary and they weren't competing with each other. You have to take that long view. If you don't, and if you don't start that internal, and the other key to this is if you don't start your internal inspection plan within the first month of your command, you'll be chasing your butt the whole time, right? So I laid out that internal inspection plan that got me to every functional area by the end of my command. So I didn't have any blind spots. And then you have to have a good XO that will keep you disciplined and keep you on task and on target.
Yeah, that's probably one of the more challenging aspects. Right people, right places.
Absolutely, and I was blessed. I had some absolutely remarkable battalion executive officers from all my 05 commands and my 06 command. I just had some great guys. Dave Bardoff was my first, and we were always just trying to keep up with Dave. He knew how to keep the trains running on time. Ron Storr did a great job. Great guys.
I guess one other thing that really struck me about your book, and it's something that I'll have to kind of put in my own notebook for the future, is you did an exceptional job getting feedback from your team, or at least the way you laid it out seemed to be quite an exceptional plan. And I even think that you wrote about speaking to the Marines that were being discharged out of your units or ending their time of service, and whether that's Marines going off to do civilian stuff or other opportunities, or the Marines that had gotten in trouble and that were being separated from the Marine Corps to learn information. I was wondering if you could talk about that and then maybe share kind of some of the interesting aspects that you learned from them that you may not have learned from other people.
Well, I was aggressive about how I got feedback from the unit, right? You need to identify your truth tellers in your organization. You need to identify them early, and once you identify your truth tellers, you need to protect them. Because quite frankly, our systems are designed where the antibodies will rapidly form on those truth tellers and they'll get pushed to the side and marginalized. But you need to identify who those folks are and keep them in your confidence. How will we get out there and find those truth tellers? Well, that's a big part about being a commander, right? Breaking laptop deflate, getting out there, spending some time with your Marines, spending some time with them around the smoke pits, down on the tank ramp, or in the chow hall. So the Sergeant Major and I, we would always eat, we eat one breakfast a week, every week in the chow hall with a different demographic of Marines. The first Wednesday of the month was always with the commanders and the Sergeant Major, but after that we'd always mix it up a little bit. So sometimes we'd be having breakfast with the privates and the lance corporals. Sometimes we'd be doing it with the staff NCOs, the staff sergeants and the gunnies. Sometimes we'd be doing it with the LDOs and the warrant officers. And as you said, one of the more colorful breakfasts we had was all the Marines that were getting administratively separated. That my Sergeant Major was a little nervous about that one, but it was actually very insightful. And I'll tell you, I was proud that each of those individuals actually owned their circumstances, and I thought that was impressive. But they did give me some candid feedback on what was going on. My first sergeant used to always tell me, my first sergeant major, I apologize, Conrad Potts was his name. He used to give me some of the most sage advice that any commander could want from their senior enlisted. He would basically walk in and tell me, "Hey, sir, I know what you said, but let me tell you what I heard." And I would always push back on that. I'm like, "Sergeant Major, that's not what I said." And of course, he'd put his hands in his face in his hands and shake his head a little bit and say, "Okay, so let me say it again. I know what you said, but let me tell you what they heard." So I needed that feedback, but then having breakfast with the Marines, I would see how that was attenuating to the unit, right, and get some candid feedback to it. And I will tell you, if you're ever doing that with your soldiers, the awkward silence is your friend, okay? The awkward silence is your friend. I would just sit there and, because the Marines have been, they know that you're going to go, they're being sent to have breadth of the commander. So you figure their platoon sergeant, their first sergeant has already wire brushed them pretty good, made sure that they don't say anything stupid to the boss, gave them a little, I don't want to call it a loyalty speech, but they made sure that they got their attention, and told them not to, quote unquote, embarrass the command, right? So you get out there, and I would just sit there. I wouldn't say anything, I wouldn't say anything. I just let that awkward silence build and build and build, and eventually the young Marines can't take it, and they'll just start dumping information on you, right? And I got better information from my awkward silence than any of the questions that I asked. But I always tried to pride myself on having some deep, penetrating questions, but also the questions that build trust right away. I'll tell you, if you're taking over command and you're doing that initial tour around, and you're meeting with your different departments and your functions, my favorite question to ask senior staff NCOs and warrant officers is, what are you going to tell me that no one else is going to tell me? It's an awesome question. It's an open-ended question, and it immediately builds that reciprocity of trust, right? And it also appeals to their ego.
Yeah.
Right? It goes right to the heart of a lot of things right there. So it's a great question.
Well, yeah, I could definitely imagine. Just because what it calls the experts to give the experts' opinions, and then it calls the folks that have information that's not going anywhere to lay out the information. Yeah, that and the other really intriguing thing, well, I shouldn't say intriguing, I guess it's the one difficult aspect of just leadership in general, is just the troop management and then dealing with kind of the disciplinary aspects of being a leader and taking care of the soldiers that have made mistakes and dealing with that, which is often incredibly time consuming. But your approach to attempt to balance that out, I thought was very good in terms of investing as much into your best performers in terms of time as you are dealing with those that you have to, administratively take care of or discipline.
Yeah, very frank. Thanks. I call it my 10-80-10 split. Like, everybody knows the old saw that you spend 90% of your time on 10% of your troops, right? And they're not talking about the best 10%, right? I don't consider that leading, though. I actually consider that reacting. Now, I'm not diminishing the amount of time that bottom 10% takes. They are a giant time suck. What I try to do is to discipline myself that every minute I spent on a Marine sailor that was being administratively separated or was being NJP'd, as you would say, Article 15, I try to spend that exact same amount of time on my top performers. I think as a service, the Marine Corps does a really poor job with that. We get so focused on trying to police up our bottom performers, right? And we write policies and regulations trying to police up the bottom 3% without regard for what message we are actually sending to the rest of the 90+% of the Marines who are actually there and busting their ass and they're doing a really good job every day. You inadvertently paint them with that brush. I always thought that if you could spend, the truth is the amount of time that we spent on that bottom 10%, well, you have to do it, right? There's very, very little return on it. But I'll tell you, if you spent that same time on a top 10%, the return on the investment is difficult to quantify, right? But it's it's a logarithmic order of magnitude that I can't assess, but I just know it's been my experience that that's where your greatest returns are going to be. We talked a little bit about how do you then discipline, that top 10% versus the bottom 10%. It's with a scalpel with the top 10%, right? You want to make those minor corrections, that you have to, but you take the axe to the bottom 10%. Marines join the Marine Corps because they think they're joining an elite organization. And when you saddle them with Marines who are overweight, that are standard, that are doing drugs, they basically it can sour the whole organization. So you have to pressurize your administrative separations policies, right, to get after that bottom 10%, hold them accountable, but make sure that you're not managing the entire organization by trying to police up that bottom whatever percentile. It just doesn't work. Instead, spend your time and resources trying to train, coach, and mentor that top 10%. Because I'll tell you what, if you identify those lead sled dogs, they'll pull the whole team faster.
I think it's called a Frito distribution, where it's something like the top 10% will produce like 90% of your kind of forward gains as a company. It's quite amazing if you can resource those few Marines or few soldiers well, what they can achieve with just a little more support along the way.
I'll share with you, the people ask, well, what was you got 50 Maxims in there, all this stuff. Well, what was your most effective leadership tool? I tell everybody it was a 39-cent stamp. Well, back then it was a 39-cent stamp. I guess it's a 49-cent stamp now. Lord knows what's going to happen with inflation, right? But my point was this. I called it my letter bombs. Because again, a big part about being a commander is getting out there and finding your top performers in your organization and recognizing them. I like to say, you know how they make your top performers, stop performing? It's real easy. All you have to do is nothing, right? But instead, I would try to get out there and I'd find those top performers. And Sergeant Major and I would walk around and we'd go out to the field and we'd be at the ramp and, I'd find Franklin, right? And whatever Franklin was doing down there at our battalion aid station, that drew me to his attention, I just write down Franklin's name in my book, and I go back to the office. I'd yell for my adjutant to come in there, and I'd have the adjutant pull the record on amps, right? So I'd be looking for the record of emergency data. We call it the RED. I assume the Army has something very similar to that.
Yes.
Okay. Well, of course, I'm pulling the red because I wanted to find out who Franklin's parents were, right? And I just take 5-10 minutes that evening before I went home, and I just, dear Mr. and Mrs. Annis, I want to tell you, how incredibly impressed I am with Franklin, right? And I just, that one or two anecdotes of like what drew my attention to his performance at that time. And then I would always finish it up with, by the way, I know he would not be as successful as he is without your support. So with this note, please, accept my gratitude for your continued support. Words to that effect. I try to personalize a little bit. Well, I called it a letter bomb because it had a 96-hour fuse. Because snail mail, it takes about 48 hours for that letter to get wherever it was going. It would take another 24 hours, for Franklin's, dad or mom, to get that letter and read it, and pick up the phone, and call their son, right, or their daughter. So I always would set a reminder on my calendar to go back to the battalion aid station 4 days later. And without fail, whatever it was that Franklin was doing that drew his attention to me, right, he was doing it 10 times faster, 10 times harder. It was like we set the man on fire. And I would just laugh with the Sergeant Major about it. And what did it cost us? It cost us, I'll confess, it didn't even cost me 39 cents or 49 cents because I always considered it official mail and I just ran it through the damn meter, right? But, it was just identifying your top performers and recognizing them and then connected, one, why are they busting their ass, right? They'll always tell you they're not busting their ass because they're looking for recognition, right? But they are, right? They want someone to notice, right? And chances are there was a reason why they joined the Army. There's a reason why they joined the Marine Corps. Because they probably wanted to make someone proud, right? And if you can take their performance and connect it, with the reason why they're performing, right, and, and acknowledge it, I'll tell you what, that lead sled dog will pull the whole team faster. They'll pull the whole team faster. It's just recognizing your top performance.
Yeah, I must say that I love that in your book, but I also love the fact that, and it's something that I never actually thought of, about taking care of some of your Marines that had like personal deaths in the family. Like the idea of setting a 1-year reminder, for Marines that lost parents. I thought that was like absolutely wonderful. And especially the fact that I think you discuss it in your book where kind of we have typical social support for individuals that encounter rough periods of time, but that social support falls away kind of the longer you get away from the initial trauma. And a lot of people can sometimes kind of grow in their inability to resolve issues, and that typically happens around the eight month mark.
Right.
where you see like people really fall down, but all the social support seems to run out somewhere around 6 months or less. So just having kind of that longer view, and kind of taking care of your Marines or soldiers over a longer period of time, I thought was quite a remarkable chapter that you'd written.
One of the things I wrote down in there, and I was actually paraphrasing Roosevelt, that Marines don't care how much you know, but they'll know how much you care, right? And just by doing those little things to let them know, how much you care, right? And if a Marine knows that you truly care about them, there's absolutely nothing they will not do for the organization. Now, notice I didn't say about you, right? Because that's the second chapter. It's not about you, right? The price of leadership, quite frankly, is self-interest. But to communicate to your Marines or your soldiers that you truly care about them, first and foremost, getting to know them, right? Not just superficially, right? But actually getting to know like what's driving them, and how they define success, and trying to train, coach, and mentor them to get where they need to go. But also, to ask, to follow up, and just to know their names, right? Know their first names, know their wives' names. And if they've had some tragedy, in their life, that you haven't forgotten about them. Right? It just, it works.
So normally I recommend, or usually ask my guests about recommended reading lists for the future, but I can say that you have done such an exceptional job. I would have to go back and count it. I'm sure you've referenced over 100 books in your book itself.
I think someone asked me, I think there's 170 reading recommendations in there. So,
yeah, it's enough to really open the door, and those will lead to thousands more. I can guarantee that. So I guess my last question to you is, well, I'm assuming with your new job it might put off things, but this is such a wonderful book. Are you having plans to pick up the pen again in the future and run the gauntlet again?
Actually, I am. So allow me to brag on my oldest daughter here for a second. So my oldest daughter, Shannon, is completing her doctorate up in Boston right now. She's going to be a psychologist. And just found out recently she's going to be a psychologist in the United States Army. So she's going to accept a commission in the Army and serve her nation. So I'm extremely proud of it. But during COVID, she had come down for a weekend to come see us in D.C., which turned into about a 3-month stay because, the virus took off and they're shutting down state borders. And so anyways, her program went online, so she was able to stay with us a little bit. And we started brainstorming, collaborating on a book on fear. So we're going to write a book on fear, on fear and anxiety, and I'm going to take a leadership and philosophical approach to it, and she's going to come and close it out with a clinician approach to it. So we're collaborating on it, and I don't know how many lessons it's going to be. It's going to be more than 50,
Okay.
But we're working on fear and anxiety. Right now the title's Fear Not, but when you have these titles, I mean, I'll tell you, Maxims, that wasn't the title of the book. You send it to a publisher though, and they'll tell you what it's going to be titled. So right now it's Fear Not, but we'll see.
Well, I'm guessing there will be a lot of Stoic references in that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, sir, do you have any final comments or thoughts for the audience?
The only thing, as I said, this was my leadership journal, and if you take anything away from the book, right, it should be to start your own leadership journal, right? So if any of those lessons resonate with you, by all means, take them, repurpose them, rebrand them, make them your own. But the best advice I could give, any young soldier or young Marine looking forward to step off and assume the mantle of leadership is start journaling this stuff. Start journaling it because it's going to help chart your professional growth going forward. So, and it's also a good way to pay it forward to your subordinates. That's how this book actually came to be. Was when I was a battalion commander. I talked about my leadership journal, and at the front of the book, the back of the book, and I guess I had a privileged career because I had more entries in the front, though I probably learned more from the entries in the back. And I took that outline, that stream of consciousness, if you will, and I paid it forward. I gave it to my lieutenants, and I walked them through it over a series of PMEs, professional education events, I was able to pay it forward to him. So, hey, that would be my only closing remark here. Pay it forward.
Well, I deeply thank you for taking the time with me for today, and I definitely encourage the audience to go out and check out the book Marine Maxims. I think the Naval Institute Press has it at the best price, but you can find it on most common retailers out there. For more videos and interviews on the topic of military history and military self-development, I invite you to subscribe to the Evolving Warfighter. And until next time, focus on your self-development so we can dominate the modern battlefield. Thank you.